I had started out originally with just a thought of just kind of addressing uh, Tyler and Faith and the church about just a few comments about engagement and marriage and all that. And I sat down and I started writing it. And the more I wrote, the more it made sense and the more logical it became. And so I continued writing and it kept going and continued writing. And it ended up being a full length sermon. But here's the thought: marriage is like an airplane trip. Yes, that is the actual thought of that is the title of the sermon. Amen. Marriage is like an airplane trip. And I believe that when I go through this, you will see this to be extremely accurate and very, very sensical, very logical, and truly it really makes sense. And in it are some great principles, I believe, that we can learn from. And so this is the direction the Lord let me go, and He didn't put anything else on my heart and mind. So this is what we have to say about it from Scriptures tonight. Marriage is a lot like taking an airplane on a trip. Now, just so you know, I have a tremendous amount of background in aircraft industry. My a little over 50% of my secular career was 100% directly involved in aircraft, whether it would be the airframes or whether it was the engines or whatnot, mechanical engineering, manufacturing engineering, project management as well. And so I have a lot of background in this connection. And so it just was a thought that it began and expanded on there. But I want you to listen to this, and the silliness of the title aside, listen to the principles that are really here. And I guarantee you that if you've been married any length of time, you're going to look back and what's said here, and you're going to say, yeah, there it is. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Marriage is a lot like taking an airplane on a trip. In the beginning, there is the manufacturer of the aircraft. Then, before the aircraft is ever flown, it goes through many checks and balances. Airworthiness checks, flight checks, validations, certifications. These are all performed by the people building the aircraft and the agencies that are responsible for safe flight operation. This equates and is much like parents making little aircraft, then raising them, teaching them, training them. Be fruitful and multiply. Train up a child, and when he is old, he shall not depart from it. Agencies outside the manufacturer, like grandparents and pastors and youth pastors and instructors and teachers, should come alongside the manufacturer, the parents, and help them to get the job done. Ultimately, the goal is to get them to make their airworthiness flights and obtain their certifications. The aircraft are not the manufacturer's possession forever, though. Otherwise, what would be the purpose? Children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is His reward. Children are for God's purposes, not the parents' purposes. Now, regarding this idea about airworthiness checks upon the aircraft, because that's really what we're confined to in the discussion so far, airworthiness checks and flight certifications, these are things that should not be done when the pilot and the crew board the plane. It's a little too late to determine if that aircraft can fly at that point. Then, once checks are passed, once certificates are given, once validations occurred, once airworthiness is deemed there, the aircraft is put in service. It's made available, if you will. In other words, they're old enough to get married. Now, at this point, the aircraft is turned over from the manufacturer to the purchasing company, Southwest or United or any of those other companies or smaller companies, whatever, and to an airport. And a lot of other people are now involved in the process of what happens with the aircraft. The manufacturer is no longer not involved, it's still involved. But now there are other agencies that are greater and bigger, or not greater or bigger in intensity, but they have different jobs and functions, and they all come together to support the purpose of the aircraft. These are the people that have the pilots, the co-pilots, the crews, both cabin and ground, airport personnel that'll become involved. These are the ones who will ultimately be brought together with the aircraft to accomplish the purpose for the aircraft. Remember, the whole idea is for the aircraft to fly, not sit in a hangar. And so now it's time. The aircraft that needs a pilot and the pilot that needs an aircraft. Up to this point, each of the respective parts to the analogy are in their own building and their own training processes with very little to no interaction between the pilot and the aircraft. But eventually, that will change. Dr. Runyon used to tell me, when it came to this idea of pastoring young people as they were growing up, he said, if he's busy serving the Lord and looking forward in the service of Christ, and she's busy serving the Lord and looking forward in the service of Christ, then one day they will both look up at the same time and they'll see each other. And they'll go, hey. And the other one will go, hey. And he said, you focus on keeping them serving the Lord, and the Lord will focus on them seeing each other. Best advice we could give. Let God be God. Do what we can do and let God do what he can do. Now the time comes when the aircraft is there and the pilot is there and they see each other, and it's very exciting. Very, very exciting. That new shiny aircraft. Wow. She's so pretty. And that pilot, oh, he's so dapper. Got his pilot hat on and his suit. And he's got his wings and bars and everything. Why do they still dress like that? I don't know. I've never asked, but they do. But you know who the pilot is. You know who the captain is. Amen. And a whole new process begins in each. The pilot and the aircraft. First thing that happens, there's an exterior pre-flight check. The pilot walks the exterior of the aircraft. Have you ever stood inside an aircraft terminal at the big glass windows and you look out and you watch the pilots? They'll walk around the aircraft and they're double checking everything, making sure there's no glaringly obvious issues such as leaking seals, inoperable lights, structural cracks, flat tires, problems, any of those kind of things. And so too, the pilot goes through a very similar process. The young man will, if you will. And to a degree, the young lady, they go through a process whereby they check the exterior. Are they attracted to one another? Who wants to marry an ugly person? Nobody. You want to know if you're attracted to them. Amen? Some of you missed this. We should go anyway. You double check a few things. Are they of the same belief system? Can two walk together except they be agreed? Be not unequally yoked. You begin to look and see that exterior check. Can you see yourself with that one forever? These are basic, fundamental pre-flight exterior checks that go on. How that dance happens is variable from one to another and from one person to another person. How all that comes about, that's the uniqueness of humanity. But ultimately, they all go through that. Every couple that's going to get married goes through this process. Next comes the interior pre-flight check. That's where the pilot sits in the cockpit and he spends a vast amount of time running through the checklists of the system's compatibility. When you walk onto an aircraft, if you're going to fly somewhere and you walk in and you notice that the doors are, unless it's an overseas flight, the doors are always on what would be the pilot side, or sitting in the cockpit, the left-hand side. You walk in, you always turn to the right. Pilot and co-pilot are into the cockpit on the left. And they're in there, and they will inevitably, every single time, and I have flown hundreds of times, they will have their checklists. And they will be sitting there, and the two of them will be talking, and one's pushing buttons, one's double checking. Yep, on, yep, good. Oh, that's good. Yep, nope, that's good. And going through all those checks. Running through system compatibilities, ensuring that fire detectors are working, weather radar's up, warning lights are operable, flight lights are correct, other systems are operating within spec. And so too, the couple will begin to talk and spend time together. The exterior check is done. I've agreed. Yep, I think this one's a kind of a cute looking aircraft. Yeah, they're not so bad. Okay. All right. And they start talking about more specific things. Asking each other many questions, seeking to see each other's actions and reactions, verifying that systems are compatible and that they are functioning within specified parameters. And when all the systems seem to be a go, and it looks like this thing could work, like I'm thinking this airplane can fly, we come to this thing called preparation for taxiing. At some point, the pilot will realize, this is the aircraft for me, and I'd really like to fly it. And so the pilot will give the go-ahead to retract the jetway and to release the wheel chocks and to ensure all passengers are seatbelted and buckled in. And he'll head to the appropriate runway head, the beginning, the lead in to the proper runway. See, this is where the couple has broached the marriage, a life together topic, and it seems like she might say yes. And then the pilot communicates with the tower. All systems seem go. Pre-flight inspection done. All the little lights are working. Calls into the tower and asks for permission to move forward. Asks for the hand in marriage. Then the pilot has to get the right instructions and has to ascertain the right headings and the right runway instructions. Things like ring size, color, type, design, the things that are important and really do matter. All with the attempt of one thing, getting the aircraft to the appropriate runway location. Because we can't just take off from where the jetway is. Okay? And then the proposal. We saw some pictures of it. The proposal. In the aircraft industry, this is what is called the time slot. Every aircraft is given a time slot. The time slot is from 5 minutes before to 10 minutes after a specified time, and the pilot has been given the specific time which they need to put the aircraft at the head of the runway. And it is up to the pilot to work backwards from that given moment to when he must start all the things that need to happen to get to that moment. And so too, the pilot, knowing the time slot, works their overall schedule of duties, ensuring proposal happens correctly and in the right time slot. Now, up to now, the time spent together honestly has been brief. In the grand scheme of things, it's been brief. It has been sporadic with increasing interaction. The pilot and aircraft go from absolutely no time together because aircraft was being built, pilots being trained, all that's going on separately, to some limited interaction, to a few more focused timings, then to sitting in the cockpit, but still not fully focused on the trip, more focused on the time spent on the externals and the internals and the bigger ticket items, if you will. But now comes the utmost focus, concentration, dedication, and time spent together. This is go time. Do you remember Mary and Joseph in the betrothal period? Remember that? And she was with child. And Joseph had to decide if he was going to break it off or not. There's nothing to do with you. This is just part of the process. So yours is already done. We've decided that for you. Just kidding. And although we never want to see it break apart at this point, there is always a chance that something big happens that causes you to have to abort. You see, from the point of the head of the runway at which sits the aircraft and the pilot, there are three critical factors that take place in order for that aircraft to fly. They are very specifically known as, the first one is V1 decision speed. V1 decision speed. That's a velocity 1. This is a very critical velocity, at which point aborting the takeoff should not happen in any way. Once that speed is achieved, you have to get the aircraft off the ground. Doesn't matter what you do. Cannot stop. If you were to try to stop, that could be a fiery wreck. Okay? The ability to safely stop the aircraft at the point of V1 or beyond can't be had. For the couple, the run-up to the wedding day is vital, and it is very important. Up till now, quite honestly, truthfully, everything seemed nice, cool, and exciting. But now it's serious. Now it's serious. And it must be carefully tracked. Now, where an aircraft can abort before V1, we never want to see that happen in, obviously, a marriage or an engagement or any of that process. But there's a second factor, and it's called the ASDS. And it is the acceleration stop distance available. The acceleration stop distance available. This is the distance between where the aircraft commences its takeoff and the point at which it must shut off engines, reverse thrust, and apply brakes should the takeoff be rejected. This is a distance, aircraft dependent, that the pilot actually tracks, making sure that all systems are functioning properly up until that point, that distance, because stopping after that mark is impossible. He is given not only a velocity, he is also given a distance. And if he cannot stop before that velocity and distance are met, there is no aborting. It is get it off the ground no matter what you do, or you will wreck. Just like the V1 decision speed, the distance marker to ensure all systems are a final go. And there's a third part, and that's the end of the runway, which grows very close very quickly. That's what we call takeoff. This is where the plane leaves the ground. It takes flight. We would call that the wedding day. The moment when the pilot and the aircraft are one, and they are flying into the journey onward towards the destination. For the couple, the full transference of authority has occurred. The two have become one. She no longer has her father's name, but now has the pilot's name. He leads and directs, and she responds and follows. Some would say, honestly, that at this point, it is most important that you spend the greatest amount of your time together after you get married. I would honestly argue against that with 32 years of successful marriage. I just disagree. Because the most important part was getting to takeoff. Because if you don't get all that down right, you got a mess on your hands. After the wedding day, life happens. Life happens. Are you not married people out here? Life happens. I mean, amen, double amen, and a whole lot more amens. Shake that tree. The tree's now broke. It is important to spend time together. But if you did not get it solidified before takeoff, you're going to have a lot of bumpy air in the ride. Better to spend the maximum amount of time possible before takeoff with a focused concentration to ensure all things are a go and everything is working correctly. The pilot rightly puts the greatest amount of his energy. His heart races at the highest maximum point in focusing, running down the runway for those first few moments before and after takeoff. Because everything hinges on there. Do I hit something on the runway? Do I blow a tire? Does a wheel give loose? Does a flap not respond? Does something not take place? Do I lose certain thrust in the engine? Do I pick up a hydraulic leak or a fluid leak? What is the issues? I've got to get to V1, ASDS. Am I good to go? And then right after that, we take it. It comes off the ground. And now I've got a big job on my hands. I've got to get to cruising speed and altitude. This is the most dangerous and greatest possibility of risk is during this time. The aircraft is put under some of its most demanding pressure and tests to ensure that it can run all systems to get it off the ground. In the new Boeing 777 wing, it is an all-composite wing. And it literally stretches 3.5 feet up. So from sitting on the ground to when that airplane finally breaks free from the ground, that wing will bend 3.5 feet. That's this tall. That's a sheer engineering marvel that it does that. Pilots, that's the most intense time for them. Now, by all this, I do not mean or imply living together before marriage. Absolutely not. That is unbiblical. That would not be right. But remember that before we even got to the head of the runway, we're kicking the tires, we're pulling the flaps, we're checking the buttons are on and lit when they need to be and off and not on when they don't need to be. And you verify that everything's looking and acting correctly without being under the load and under any real pressure. But now it's go time. And you had better make sure it is all functioning correctly before V1 decision speed and ASDS. The idea of boarding before these is absolutely not what you want to do. And so all eyes need to be on the takeoff, the run down the runway, and leaving the ground. Now, once the aircraft's off the ground, it's not done yet. It's got to get to cruising altitude. And so like the honeymoon, it should be a time away from family and friends, super concentrated on each other, and making sure that you get to cruising altitude and speed as quickly, efficiently, and safely as you possibly can. Pilot and aircraft are performing under some of their heaviest load and greatest amount of stress as they are now figuring out, holy moly, we're actually flying. And an interesting phenomenon takes place. If you've ever had the opportunity to fly or be in a smaller aircraft, helicopter specifically, about 10, 20 feet off the ground's no big deal. Then you're like, it's just getting up there. And at about 100 feet, you're like, I can still see the rocks. And a couple 100 feet, you're like, okay, this is really going to hurt if I fall. At 30,000 feet, you don't think about falling. You're an airplane. You're up there flying. You're going, oh, it's so pretty. And look at that. And oh, there's the Mississippi and the Grand Canyon and all the different landmarks. During that time, the pilot doesn't communicate with the crew. And the crew doesn't talk to the pilot. And if you notice, they sit, buckled up, shut up, sit down, don't move. You know why? Because the pilot's making sure everything is happening just right. Because it takes very little during those early days to pull that aircraft right out of the sky. If you've never seen videos of bird strikes, go out there and watch a few. It's very scary. I remember one time I flew from northern Pennsylvania to southern Pennsylvania with Nancy's dad. We had to go down to a customer, and we had this little 4-seater aircraft, and we took off, and we're climbing up, and he starts banking, and he's looking off to the left as we're banking left, and I'm looking out to the right, and there's fuel pouring out of the wing. I mean, just pouring. And I'm like, tapping the pilot, and he's like, yes. And I'm like, and immediately, right? Radio's into the tower, got to abort, got to land immediately, fuel pouring out of the wings. Thankfully, they just forgotten to tighten the cap. But hey, whatever, right? No big deal. We made it. We're flying now. We finally made it through that climb. We've gotten to the point we were working to achieve. We're at cruising speed and altitude. Now listen, it doesn't mean that we switch on autopilot and ignore everything. You know, I told you that I loved you at the altar and everything changes, I'll let you know. No, no, no. Although at cruising in altitude in an aircraft, they can turn on autopilot, they still pay attention to everything going on. But in marriage, you better not turn on autopilot. But it does mean that the aircraft has come to a state of less stress and the pilot has come to a state of more relaxed. In other words, the pilot and the plane are beginning to settle into a routine in a more symbiotic state. Heading is in front. Nose is pointed correctly. Flaps and ailerons are trimmed correctly. Engines are at optimal power levels. Pilots looking for efficiency instead of survival. Aircraft is being treated well and happy and is in the intended state and purpose. I'm flying. All of that can be done because the time was spent before takeoff to make sure everything would be working correctly at altitude and cruising speed. Now in flight, during this time, there is bound to be turbulence. I don't know how many of you have ever been through turbulence on an aircraft. Some turbulence is kind of cute and neat. Oh, that was kind of bumpy. That was wild. Some turbulence is not much fun. Cups are flying. It's just crazy, right? There are rough times that the pilot and the aircraft encounter while flying. These can sometimes be external factors that come along, often unseen, and bam, you drop a couple thousand feet. Drinks and snacks go flying. Course settings get disrupted. And generally, you hit your head on the overhead storage compartment if you're not buckled in. But they can also be times of smooth sailing. Fluffy white clouds, clear blue skies. This is what we call the time of life. New pets, babies, a house mortgage, a new car. It's all turbulence. Some makes you hit your head. Some just tickles your belly. But some turbulence can be worse. Things like a baby with Downs, a small child with cancer, a house fire, a car crash with severe injuries. They can be especially bad turbulence and pretty rough all around. And if you didn't prepare before you got to that turbulence, you're not ready to handle the catastrophe that is being placed upon the pilot and plane. Sometimes there can be mechanical failures that cause in-flight problems. The air system stops working. One of the flight attendants or passengers is throwing up all over people. There's an internal air cabin problem. There's a cause of rough time on the flight that has to be addressed. All turbulence can be handled well, though, when you do a few things. Know the manual. Understand the systems. Have spent the time in proper pre-flight checks and training, and have done your homework, and yes, have faith in God. This is the time of life that you learn how to lean on God and one another. But we're not done yet, are we? We're only flying at this point. For the whole purpose of the aircraft and the pilot is to reach a destination. And so bringing it home and landing at that destination, obviously the goal is to come to the end of the journey having had a safe flight, dealing with any turbulence and any bumpy situations, and land safely. Sometimes that landing can be kind of difficult. Sometimes that landing can be a little rough. It's going to take the right amount of work, patience, focus, and concentration, and quite honestly, faith to achieve the goal. But in the end, it pays off. Truly, marriage is a lot like an airplane flight. Tyler and Faith, do these things. Put Jesus Christ in this book in the center of what one day will be your marriage. You're foolish if you don't start now. You're foolish if you don't figure it out now. As much as we'd like to just bury our head in the sand and say, oh, everybody will be good. The kids are raised in church. They're all Christians. Everything's good. Turbulence can be pretty tough on a family. Amen. It's just like an airplane ride. It's simple.